The rain had been falling for hours, drenching the Texas highway in a relentless sheet of water that blurred the lines between sky and earth. The windshield wipers of Ethan's old sedan screeched back and forth, barely keeping pace with the downpour. Rebecca Becca Hayes sat stiffly in the passenger seat, her fingers curled tight around the strap of her purse. She had insisted on coming only because Ethan had demanded a ride back into town after another failed meeting with men she did not want to know about. Her gut told her this drive would not end well, and her gut was rarely wrong when it came to her older brother. Ethan's jaw worked furiously as he drove his knuckles white against the steering wheel. The faint stench of alcohol lingered in the car, mingling with the acrid smell of wet upholstery. He had been silent for miles, but Becca felt the storm inside him brewing louder than the thunder rolling above them. She had refused to co-sign a loan for him earlier that day. It was not the first time she had said no, but tonight in his mind, it seemed unforgivable. At 28, Becca was still paying off her student debt from law school. Ethan, at 32, had squandered 3 jobs and countless opportunities. He carried gambling debts like shadows that never left, and those debts had teeth. He wanted her name on the dotted line to shield himself, and when she refused, something inside him snapped. "You owe me." "Becca," Ethan growled, finally breaking the heavy silence. His voice was low, shaking with rage. "Family comes first. You hear me? Family comes before your precious career." Becca turned toward him, her voice calm but steady, though fear rippled through her chest. "I will not ruin my life because of your choices, Ethan. Family does not mean covering up every one of your mistakes." That was when he slammed his palm against the dashboard so hard the glove compartment rattled. "You ungrateful brat," he spat. "I carried you when Dad said you were worthless, and this is how you repay me. Maybe you should learn what loyalty feels like." The sedan swerved slightly as he jerked the wheel with one hand. Becca instinctively reached for the door handle, her pulse spiking. The rain outside was blinding the slick asphalt, a river of danger. But her brother's eyes had gone cold, and she knew she was not safe sitting beside him. In a sudden movement, Ethan leaned across her, yanked the door latch, and shoved hard against her shoulder. The door flung open, with a violent gust of wind and rain, the roar of tires on water filling her ears. For one terrifying second, her body tilted toward the rushing blur of highway lights. Becca's scream was swallowed by the storm as her fingers clawed desperately at the seatbelt strap. Her nails tore against the nylon blood beating beneath the edges as she fought to anchor herself inside the car. Her hair whipped wildly across her face, mixing with the spray of rain that stung like needles against her skin. Ethan pressed harder, his face twisted in fury. "Jump then, little sister. Let's see if you survive without me." Her body half dangled from the car, her legs scraping against the wet frame. She could taste iron in her mouth where she had bitten her lip in panic. Her muscles screamed, but instinct forced her to cling tighter, every ounce of strength pulled from the will to live. Headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. A police cruiser had caught the swerving motion of Ethan's car. Its siren wailed as blue and red lights ignited the storm. Ethan cursed under his breath, jerking the wheel back to the center of the lane. He yanked Becca by her coat collar, dragging her roughly back into the car just as the cruiser pulled alongside. The officer's loudspeaker crackled through the rain. "Driver, pull over immediately." Ethan's face drained of color, his bravado faltering under the sweep of authority. With shaking hands, he slowed the car and veered onto the shoulder. The tires splashed through puddles before grinding to a stop against the guardrail. Becca collapsed against the seat, trembling, her breath shallow and ragged. She held her bleeding hand against her chest, heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the storm. She had survived the unthinkable, but her brother's rage had crossed a line that could never be taken back. The officer's flashlight pierced through the downpour as the cruiser door slammed shut. Heavy boots splashed across the asphalt. Ethan muttered curses under his breath, his bravado returning in fragments. "Keep your mouth shut," he hissed at Becca. "Say nothing. You hear me?" But Becca's eyes were no longer filled with fear alone. There was something else simmering in her gaze now. Resolve. The officer's knock against the driver's window thundered through the car. Rain streamed down the glass in jagged rivers, but Becca could see the badge gleaming beneath the lights. Safety had finally arrived. For the first time that night, she believed that someone might actually listen. At the station, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh glare over the cramped interrogation room where Rebecca sat shivering in a blanket. Her damp clothes clung to her skin, and every muscle in her body ached from the struggle. She replayed the moment on the highway again and again, hearing Ethan's voice screaming in her ear and feeling the rush of air pulling her toward the asphalt. When the door opened, Ethan strode in with a swagger that made her stomach twist. His hair was still wet, but he had managed to straighten his shirt as if to appear respectable. "She tried to jump out herself," he said quickly before the officer could ask a question. "She has these breakdowns, you know, always been unstable. Ask anyone in town." Rebecca's lips parted to protest, but her father's voice cut in before she could utter a word. Robert Hayes entered the room with the authority of a man who had chaired the local bank board for decades. His suit was pressed, his tie impeccable, and his eyes hard as stone. "Stop exaggerating, Rebecca," he snapped. "You have embarrassed this family enough tonight. We will settle this privately." Her mother Linda followed behind her hands, wringing the strap of her purse, eyes swollen from tears. "Please, officers," she pleaded, her voice trembling, "do not make this worse. Families fight, siblings fight. It is nothing criminal." Rebecca felt the words crush her chest like another shove. She looked at them all, her brother lying, her father dismissing, her mother begging, and wondered if she had ever truly belonged in this family. The officer who had pulled them over, Maria Torres, remained steady. "Ma'am, your daughter could have been killed. This is not simply a family matter." Robert's gaze shifted to the officer, sharp and commanding. "Officer, I have served this community for 40 years. We do not need baseless accusations ruining reputations. My son would never attempt to harm his sister." Ethan smirked behind his father, arms crossed as if the matter was already closed. Rebecca's voice cracked as she tried to speak. "He pushed me. He opened the door and tried to throw me out, but Robert thundered over her. 'Enough with the dramatics. You are always seeking attention, always twisting stories to make yourself a victim.'" The words hit harder than Ethan's shove ever could. Linda reached out timidly to touch Rebecca's arm, but pulled back at Robert's glare. "Please, Becca," she whispered, "do not drag us through more humiliation. Just say you slipped. Just tell them it was an accident." Rebecca stared at her mother, heat rising in her chest. For years, she had accepted these cover stories, had swallowed her truth to keep peace. But tonight, she felt the deep crack forming between survival and silence. Still, the weight of their pressure pinned her in place. Ethan leaned against the wall, his smile widening. "See, she does not deny being dramatic. Always was clumsy, always making a scene." The officer's pen scratched against her notepad, but she did not intervene yet. Rebecca's heart pounded. She knew if she shouted the truth, her father would shout louder. If she cried, her mother would beg her to stop. If she stayed silent, the lie would win again. The room spun with the echoes of every time she had been told she was too sensitive, too reckless, too needy. She lowered her eyes to her trembling hands and whispered only to herself, "Why is it always me who pays the price?" Robert stood tall over her chair. "Because you bring shame on us. Because you never learned your place." The officer finally raised her hand. "Enough. We will take official statements separately. Miss Hayes will have her chance to speak without interruption." Rebecca looked up, hope flickering for the first time that night. Ethan rolled his eyes, muttering under his breath, but Robert placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder, warning him to keep control. Linda dabbed at her tears, whispering prayers that sounded more like excuses. In that moment, Rebecca realized the truth she had tried to deny all her life. Her family was not her protector. They were her cage, and every time she reached for freedom, they closed the door tighter. Tonight was supposed to end with her broken body on the highway, another accident explained away. But she was still alive, and maybe this time someone outside the Hayes family would believe her. The rain still pounded outside the station windows, but inside, Rebecca felt the first faint stirrings of defiance. The storm was far from over yet. For the first time, she thought she might withstand it. The hours dragged on in the station, and as Rebecca sat waiting, her mind slipped into the corridors of memory she had tried to keep locked away. She remembered being 12 and crouching on the basketball court with blood streaming from her nose after Ethan had slammed the ball into her face. Robert had marched out onto the court, shaking his head at her clumsiness while telling the coach it was just a rough play. No one questioned him. At 15, she had been locked out of the house in the dead of winter, wearing only a sweatshirt because Ethan had decided she deserved to be taught a lesson for talking back. She had pounded on the door until her knuckles bled, and finally Linda had let her in, whispering that she must not upset her brother again. Rebecca had shivered by the fireplace while Ethan smirked from the couch. When she was 17, Ethan had driven recklessly with her in the passenger seat, swerving through red lights just to scare her. When she screamed, Robert laughed and said it would toughen her up. Each memory was a scar invisible on the surface but carved deep into her bones. She thought of the time she had studied all night for an exam, only for Ethan to burst into her room at dawn, throwing her notes into the trash and telling their parents she had skipped school. When she protested, Robert's hand had struck her cheek with the sting of finality. "Do not ever shame this family," he had growled. Linda had simply stood by, wringing her hands. The pattern was clear now, though at the time she had convinced herself each event was isolated. But the lies had formed a wall around her built brick by brick from her parents' need to preserve reputation. Every time she had whispered the truth, someone in the family had silenced her. Ethan was always excused as passionate, troubled, misunderstood. She was always labeled as dramatic, careless, unstable. That was the story the Hayes family told their neighbors, their church, their colleagues. And because Robert Hayes was respected as a banker, and Linda as a dutiful wife, people believed them. Rebecca remembered walking down the main street and hearing whispers behind her back girls from school repeating what they had heard from their parents, that Rebecca Hayes was prone to exaggeration, that she made up stories for attention. The shame had seeped into her skin until she doubted her own mind. Tonight in the station, those doubts returned with force. Her father's glare had been the same glare he used when she tried to tell the truth years ago. Her mother's trembling voice had carried the same plea for silence, and Ethan's smug smirk had not changed since childhood. He thrived on the protection their parents gave him. Rebecca's chest tightened as she thought of how many times she could have died already. The reckless driving, the locked doors, the fists and insults, the endless manipulation. It was a miracle she had survived this long. And yet, she had survived. Every scar was a reminder of resilience, even if she had not called it that before. She was alive because she had refused to give Ethan the satisfaction of seeing her broken. Her law school years had been her sanctuary, the only time she had lived away from home. But debt had pulled her back under the same roof and into the same cycle. She told herself it was temporary, that once her residency ended, she would leave for good. But Ethan's debts had become more dangerous, and now he wanted to drag her into them. Refusing to sign had nearly cost her life. Rebecca pressed her eyes shut, forcing the memories back into the box, but they scratched and clawed to get out. The officer's earlier words echoed in her mind. "This is not an accident. This is attempted murder." Those words clashed with Robert's booming condemnation. "Stop exaggerating." The tug-of-war between truth and denial had defined her entire life. She clenched her fists and felt the sting of torn nails from where she had clawed at the seatbelt. Blood crusted along her palm, grounding her in the present. For years, she had been told she was invisible, fragile, hysterical. Tonight, the evidence of her pain dripped down her own hand. For the first time, she wondered if maybe her scars could speak louder than her family's lies. And if they could, maybe she was not powerless after all. When dawn finally broke through the blinds of the hospital room, Rebecca lay on a stiff bed with monitors beeping steadily beside her. Her body ached in ways that felt both old and new bruises blooming across her ribs and arms. The storm outside had passed, but inside she was still trembling. Dr. Alan Price entered with a clipboard in hand, his expression calm yet firm. He examined her carefully, noting the swelling along her wrists and the faint discoloration along her back. His trained eyes lingered longer than most doctors ever had. "You have more than fresh bruises," he said in a measured voice. "These markings suggest older injuries that were never properly treated. Can you explain that Rebecca opened her mouth, then closed it again, the familiar fear pressing her tongue down? For years, every explanation had been decided for her, every truth dismissed before it could escape her lips. She gave the practiced line. I fell. I am clumsy. Dr. Price lowered the clipboard, his gaze steady on hers. Miss Hayes, I have worked in emergency medicine for 20 years. I know the difference between clumsiness and patterns of trauma. These are grip marks. These are defensive injuries. Someone has been hurting you. His words pierced through the haze like a spotlight. Rebecca felt heat rise in her chest, tears threatening to spill, but she remained silent. Dr. Price did not push further. Instead, he turned to the nurse. Document everything. We will run scans. When he left, Officer Maria Torres entered the room, her uniform still damp from the long night. She placed her hat on the counter and pulled up a chair. Rebecca, she began gently. I was on that highway. I saw the way your brother was driving, the way he shoved you. This is not an accident. This is attempted murder. The words hung heavy in the sterile air. Rebecca's pulse quickened. No one in her family had ever named it for what it was. They had called it mistakes, quarrels, exaggerations. To hear an officer state it so plainly made her feel both terrified and relieved. He will twist it, Rebecca whispered. My parents will say I am lying. They always do. Torres leaned forward, her voice steady. Your parents are not the judge here. The law is. And the law sees what happened. For the first time, Rebecca felt the possibility that truth could survive outside the walls of her family. The officer's certainty wrapped around her like armor. When Dr. Price returned with the results of her scans, he placed them on the light board. The illuminated images revealed more than fresh bruises. They showed fractures along her ribs, some healing, some new. Tiny lines across her wrist where old breaks had fused without proper care. He traced the outlines with his pen. These are not the result of a single fall, he explained. This is a pattern of repeated harm. As a mandated reporter, I am legally required to notify authorities. Rebecca's breath hitched. Part of her wanted to beg him not to. She imagined Robert storming into the hospital, Linda sobbing in embarrassment, Ethan smirking with impunity. But another part of her, the part that still remembered dangling from the open car door, knew this might be the only chance to break free. I understand, she whispered. Dr. Price nodded. You are safe here. Hospital security has been notified. No one can remove you without my approval. Outside the door, Rebecca could hear her father's voice raised in anger, demanding to know why it was taking so long. For the first time, she did not feel immediate fear. She felt the flicker of hope. Someone was standing between her and the storm. Someone was documenting what her body had carried for years. And perhaps at last her truth would not be buried beneath her family's lies. By the afternoon, the investigation had shifted from suspicion to confirmation. Officer Torres returned with a small tablet in her hand, her eyes sharper than before. She set it on the rolling tray beside Rebecca's bed and pressed play. The footage from the highway camera flickered into view, grainy but clear enough to betray the truth. The sedan swerved violently, the passenger door flung open, and Ethan's arm extended in a shove. The image of Rebecca's body half out of the car was frozen in time, undeniable. Rebecca's stomach twisted as she watched. Tears blurred her vision not only from the pain of reliving the terror, but from the overwhelming relief that finally something beyond her voice proved it had happened. This is the state's property now, Torres said firmly. This will go before a judge. No rumor or denial can erase it. At that moment, the door opened and Robert Hayes entered, his polished shoes clicking against the tile. He carried himself as though the room were his boardroom, as though authority were stitched into his suit. Linda trailed behind him, eyes, red lips pressed thin. Rebecca. Robert began his tone-cutting, you will retract whatever nonsense these people are writing. Ethan is your brother. He would never harm you. Tell them the truth before this goes any further. Rebecca's chest constricted. Her father's certainty had always been unshakable, but this time Officer Torres stood between them. Sir, she said, her hand resting near her belt, you will not intimidate your daughter. We have video evidence and medical confirmation. Your son is the suspect in an attempted murder case." Robert's face darkened, the confident mask faltering. "This is absurd. You are destroying our family's reputation." Torres did not flinch. "The video destroys nothing but lies." Linda clasped her hands together and whispered toward her daughter. "Please, Becca, you know how people talk in town. If this goes public, we will never be welcomed again. Just say you slipped." Rebecca shook her head slowly, her voice trembling yet stronger than before. "I did not slip. He pushed me. And you both know it." The silence that followed was heavy, punctured only by the steady beep of the monitor beside her bed. For once, no one could speak over her. The truth glowed on the screen behind them. Later that evening, Dr. Price returned with a folder. Inside were photographs of her injuries, detailed medical notes, and a timeline of older fractures discovered in her scans. He placed them gently on the tray. "This is a comprehensive record," he explained. "It shows not only what happened last night, but a history of violence. It is thorough enough for court." Rebecca traced the edges of the papers with shaking fingers. She felt exposed, her pain displayed in ink and images, yet she also felt vindicated. These documents carried weight her words alone had never held. Outside the room, whispers moved through the hospital halls. Robert had already called an attorney attempting to frame the story as the exaggerations of an unstable daughter. Rebecca heard fragments through the thin walls. Words like hysterical attention seeking unwell. They were the same accusations she had grown up with, recycled to protect Ethan once more. But this time she was not defenseless. The footage, the scans, the notes all formed a fortress around her. Claire arrived late that night, her friend's eyes wide with shock as she embraced Rebecca gently. "I heard what happened," she murmured. "They cannot spin their way out of this anymore." Rebecca clung to her feeling for the first time in years that she was not alone. She realized that the story her family had crafted about her being fragile and dramatic was collapsing under the weight of facts. The fortress of lies Robert had built for decades now had cracks spreading in every direction. For years, Rebecca had been silenced, her voice buried under manipulation, but the evidence now spoke with a volume no one could deny. And as she lay back against the stiff pillow, listening to the hum of machines, she whispered to herself words she had never dared to believe. "The truth is finally louder than them." Rebecca knew that evidence alone would not stop her family from twisting the narrative. Her father had influence in town, her mother had sympathy in the church, and Ethan had always thrived on manipulation. If she wanted justice, she would have to be strategic. Over the next few days, while recovering in the hospital, she began building her own case with the precision of a lawyer in training. She asked Claire to bring her old journals from college notebooks filled with desperate late-night entries detailing each attack Ethan had inflicted. She flipped through pages stained with tears and ink documenting every bruise and humiliation. She felt the weight of her younger self whispering through those words, begging someone to believe her. Now those entries would serve as proof. Claire also helped her comb through old emails and text messages. Some were threats Ethan had sent in drunken rages, demanding money, cursing her with vile words. Others were pleas from Linda begging her to keep quiet after incidents that had left her bleeding or bruised. Each digital trace was another brick in the wall she was constructing. When Officer Torres visited again, Rebecca handed her a growing folder of material. The officer raised her brows, impressed. "You are building a timeline," she said. "This will be invaluable in court." Rebecca nodded. "I cannot let them bury me under lies again. If my father says I am unstable, I will show the judge my records, my injuries, my words from years ago." Torres smiled slightly. "You are not unstable. You are strong, and strong people gather evidence." That night, Rebecca sat awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of hospital machinery. Fear still gnawed at her because she knew Robert was pulling strings, calling lawyers, whispering to old colleagues. But beneath the fear burned determination. She would not just survive, she would fight. She imagined the courtroom, imagined Ethan's face when the video played, imagined her father silenced for once. The thought sent a shiver through her, equal parts terror and anticipation. Claire visited daily, sometimes bringing food, sometimes just sitting beside her. Together, they rehearsed what Rebecca might say on the stand. They practiced steady breathing, clear phrasing, calm defiance. "Do not let him rattle you," Claire advised. "They will try to provoke you, but your composure is your weapon." Rebecca wrote down every suggestion, treating preparation like studying for the most important exam of her life. She also began speaking with the prosecutor assigned to the case, offering her organized files. The prosecutor was surprised at her level of detail. "You will make my job easier," he admitted, "and you will make a powerful witness." Rebecca felt pride stir inside her, a foreign but welcome sensation. For years, she had been framed as a liability, the weak link. Now, she was the one holding the strongest cards. News trickled into the hospital from neighbors and co-workers. Robert had started spreading stories that Rebecca had long been troubled, prone to dramatics, even unstable from stress. But this time, the community was not entirely convinced. Whispers about the highway footage had circulated, and those who saw it knew the truth. Rebecca realized the lies were losing power. Sitting in the dim light of her hospital room, she whispered a promise to herself. No more silence. She pictured her father's furious eyes, her mother's pleading ones, and Ethan's cruel grin. They had built a world where she was always wrong. But now she held the tools to dismantle that world piece by piece. She was not just defending herself anymore. She was preparing to expose them. And for the first time in her life, Rebecca Hayes felt that her intelligence, her training, and her courage might finally be enough to win. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, the kind of scent that lingered in places where judgment had been handed down for generations. Rebecca sat at the witness table, her palms pressed flat against the surface to steady her trembling. Her chest rose and fell with each deep breath as she tried to block out the sight of her family sitting a few rows back. Robert sat stiff in his tailored suit, his chin raised as though daring anyone to question his authority. Linda sat beside him, wringing her hands, her eyes darting nervously between her daughter and her son. And Ethan, in a rumpled shirt and a face lined with arrogance, smirked as though the trial were nothing more than an inconvenience. The prosecutor began with the basics, asking Rebecca to recount what had happened on the highway. Her voice shook at first, but then steadied as she described the rain, the scream the door flung open, and the desperate grip on the seatbelt. Ethan leaned back in his chair, rolling his eyes with exaggerated boredom, but Rebecca pressed on her words, deliberate. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The prosecutor signaled to the technician, and the lights dimmed slightly as the screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life. The grainy footage from the traffic camera filled the screen. The room grew so quiet that even the hum of the projector seemed loud. Every person in the courtroom saw it, the car swerving, the door swinging open, Ethan's arm shoving his sister toward the blur of rushing highway. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Linda covered her mouth, her body shaking while Robert's face paled as the undeniable image played on loop. Ethan bolted upright, his smirk gone, his voice rising in protest. "That is not what it looks like. She was trying to throw herself out. She is sick. She has always been sick." The judge banged the gavel sharply, calling for order, but Ethan's voice kept cracking through the chamber. "She is lying. She is making this up to ruin me." His words fell flat against the screen that still showed his shove in chilling clarity. Rebecca's heart pounded, but for once, the weight of denial was not on her shoulders. It was on his. The prosecutor turned to the jury. "This is not hearsay. This is not speculation. This is what happened." The defense attorney scrambled to regain footing, suggesting the footage was misinterpreted, that perhaps Ethan had been reaching to steady his sister. But the prosecutor brought out the medical records, the photographs of Rebecca's injuries, the scans of older fractures, and the journals she had kept. Each piece stacked like bricks on the side of truth. When Rebecca was asked why she had stayed silent for so long, she swallowed the lump in her throat and answered, "Because every time I tried to speak, my family told me I was dramatic, unstable, clumsy. I believed them. Until the night he tried to kill me." Her words echoed through the chamber, stark and undeniable. The gallery shifted uncomfortably, whispers passing from seat to seat. People in town who had once dismissed her as fragile now stared with wide eyes at the woman who dared to speak plainly in the face of her entire family. Robert's fists clenched against his knees, his jaw tight with fury. Linda's tears fell freely, soaking the tissue in her hands. Ethan slammed his palm against the defense table, shouting, She is lying, all of it. The judge's gavel cracked again, this time louder. One more outburst and you will be removed from this courtroom. Ethan's voice broke into a snarl. She is trying to destroy us. But Rebecca simply sat straighter, her gaze steady. For the first time, she was not the one silenced. The truth had its own voice now projected larger than life for all to see. The cross-examination came sharp and relentless, but Rebecca held her ground. Each question designed to rattle her fell flat against her calm resolve. She had prepared for this, and no manipulation could erase the images on the screen. By the end of the day, the courtroom no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a battlefield, and for once she was not fighting alone. As she stepped down from the witness stand, she caught Ethan's glare, a mixture of rage and fear. She realized then that the power he had held over her for years was slipping away, crumbling under the weight of truth. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed reporters shouting questions. Rebecca shielded her eyes but did not hide. She answered with a voice both fragile and firm. The truth is out. That is all that matters. And in that moment, standing beneath the glaring sun and the gaze of a community that could no longer ignore what they had seen, Rebecca Hayes felt the first true taste of freedom. The verdict came after hours of deliberation, though for Rebecca, each tick of the clock had felt like another test of endurance. She sat in the courtroom with her hands clenched tightly together, her nails biting into her palms as she waited for the jury to return. The door opened at last, and the jurors filed in, their faces unreadable. The foreperson stood and read the words that changed everything. Guilty of attempted murder. The sound of it rang like a bell through the chamber, sharp and final. Rebecca's breath caught in her chest, tears springing to her eyes. Ethan shouted in protest, his chair scraping across the floor as he rose. Bailiffs moved quickly, restraining him as he cursed his sister, his voice echoing with venom. You will regret this, Becca. You will regret betraying your family. The judge's gavel silenced him, the order for his immediate custody delivered without hesitation. 10 years in prison. The words were printed on the official record and stamped with the seal of the court. Ethan's face drained of its arrogance as the reality sank in. He was led away in shackles, his curses fading behind the heavy doors. Rebecca felt a wave of release sweep through her body. For years, she had carried his violence in silence, but now the world saw him for what he was. The community that had once whispered about her instability now whispered about his crime. Justice had a sound, and it was louder than every denial she had ever endured. But the consequences did not stop with Ethan. Robert Hayes faced his own reckoning. News outlets reported his attempt to influence the investigation, his long history of covering up incidents within his family, and his refusal to protect his daughter. The bank board he had chaired for decades convened in an emergency session, and within days he was forced to resign. His once proud reputation crumbled. Headlines spoke of disgrace, of a man who placed image above safety. Neighbors who had admired him now avoided his gaze. Invitations dried up, respect evaporated, and Robert Hayes became a cautionary tale of arrogance exposed. Linda, too, bore the consequences. The church group that had once embraced her quietly asked her to step down from leadership. At Sunday services, she sat alone, whispers surrounding her like smoke. Friends who had once shared pews turned their shoulders, unwilling to associate with the woman who had begged her daughter to stay silent about abuse. The social standing she had clung to slipped away piece by piece. Rebecca heard of these things through Claire and through the papers, and while part of her felt the old pang of guilt, another part recognized the balance of justice. For once, she was not the one carrying the shame. It belonged to those who had earned it. A restraining order was granted swiftly, ensuring that neither Robert nor Linda could approach or contact her without consequence. For the first time in her life, Rebecca felt a circle of safety drawn around her by the law itself. She carried the document in her purse like a shield proof that her voice mattered. Outside the courthouse, cameras caught her calm face as reporters asked how she felt about her brother's sentence and her parents' fall from grace. She answered simply, her words steady. Accountability is not cruelty. It is justice. For years, I was told my pain was imaginary. Now it is recognized, documented, and addressed. That is all I ever wanted. The footage aired across local stations, and for days, people in town talked not of the Hayes family's prestige, but of their betrayal. Strangers approached Rebecca in grocery store aisles and on sidewalks, some offering condolences, others quiet admiration. A woman she barely knew whispered, "Thank you for speaking. My sister never could." Each comment reminded Rebecca that her story was no longer just her own. It was a mirror held up to a community that preferred silence until silence became impossible. In the quiet of her apartment, she allowed herself to weep not from despair, but from the release of years of weight. Justice had been delivered, consequences had been real and public, and Rebecca Hayes was no longer invisible. She was seen, and her abuser was behind bars. And in that recognition, she found the strength to begin imagining a life not defined by survival alone, but by possibility. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee and new paint, a comforting change from the cold sterility of hospital rooms and the oppressive air of the Hayes household. Rebecca unpacked the last of her boxes with Claire's help, folding sweaters into drawers and stacking books neatly on the shelf. Each item placed was a quiet declaration that this was her space, now a home built not on fear but on choice. The restraining order hung in a file on the counter, a symbol of safety rather than paranoia. She traced the edges of the paper sometimes just to remind herself that boundaries were real and enforceable. Therapy sessions filled her weeks, each appointment peeling back layers of shame she had carried for years. Her therapist guided her through memories of bruises explained away and nights spent wondering if she was the problem. Slowly, Rebecca learned to replace self-blame with clarity. "You were never weak," the therapist said one afternoon. "You were surviving in an environment designed to silence you." The words settled into Rebecca's chest like medicine she had needed for years. Work also became a source of renewal. The law firm where she had once been an intern offered her a permanent position. She threw herself into cases with focus often representing women who reminded her of herself. Each file she handled, each client she listened to, felt like another brick in the foundation of a new identity. She was no longer only Rebecca the victim. She was Rebecca the advocate, the lawyer, the survivor turned protector. At first, stepping into court again rattled her. The smell of varnish and the sight of wooden benches brought flashes of Ethan's trial. But then she remembered the way the jury had listened, the way the judge had silenced her brother's rage, and she felt steadier. She carried her own history as a tool, not a burden. Claire remained her constant support. On evenings when exhaustion threatened to undo her, Rebecca would sit at the kitchen table with her best friend sipping tea and laughing at old stories from law school. The sound of laughter felt foreign at first, like music played in a house that had never known joy, but over time it became natural. They decorated the apartment with bright curtains and photographs from trips they had dreamed of taking. It became a sanctuary of friendship and healing. Outside the walls, whispers about the Hayes family persisted. Some people still defended Robert and Linda, but many more had turned away. Ethan's name appeared in the crime blotter, his sentencing reported without sympathy. Rebecca did not seek out the news, but sometimes it reached her anyway. Instead of dread, she felt distance. Their downfall was no longer hers to carry. Nights that once were filled with panic attacks slowly shifted into quieter rest. When nightmares came, she reached for the grounding exercises her therapist had taught her. She would breathe deeply, remind herself of the date, remind herself that she was safe in her own bed. With each passing month, the shadows lifted a little more. She began speaking at small community events, sharing her experience with domestic abuse survivors. At first, her voice trembled, but soon it steadied, powered by the nods of those who understood. She realized that telling her story was not reopening wounds, but helping them close. "If one person feels less alone because I spoke," she told Claire afterward, "then it is worth every memory." Her growth was not linear. There were days she felt fragile, triggered by a smell or a phrase that echoed from her past. But she allowed herself grace on those days, reminding herself that healing was not about perfection, but persistence. Slowly, she built a life defined by agency. She took morning runs along the river, feeling the strength in her legs as proof of her resilience. She painted a small canvas for the first time since childhood, colors splashing freely without criticism. She even allowed herself to imagine love again, not as dependence, but as partnership. When colleagues asked about her past, she chose what to share, setting boundaries firmly, and each time she asserted those limits, she felt stronger. By the time the leaves turned golden and the air grew crisp, Rebecca Hayes could look at her reflection without flinching. The woman who stared back was scarred but not broken, determined but not bitter. She had transformed pain into purpose. She had found her voice not just for herself but for others who still struggled in silence. And that voice would not be taken from her again. 6 months later, Rebecca stood behind a podium in a conference hall filled with young law students and medical interns. The banner above her read, "Symposium on Recognizing and Reporting Domestic Violence." Her palms rested on the edge of the podium as she gazed out at the expectant faces. For a moment, nerves flickered through her chest, but then she remembered the countless nights she had spent wishing someone in authority would notice her bruises, her silence, her fear. Now, she was the one holding the microphone. She began by projecting the traffic footage onto the screen behind her. Gasps echoed through the hall, much like in the courtroom months before. She let the silence linger before speaking. "Proof saved my life," she said firmly. "Do not ignore what is right in front of you. Do not silence someone because the truth is uncomfortable. Evidence speaks louder than fear." She walked the audience through the medical scans and documents, explaining how overlooked injuries often tell a hidden story. She shared her journals, carefully redacted but raw enough to show the power of written testimony. Each slide carried not just facts, but a plea for vigilance. When the lecture ended, the applause rose like a tide. Students approached her with tears in their eyes, some confessing they had ignored warning signs in their own families. Rebecca listened, offering encouragement. She realized she was no longer the frightened woman clawing at a seatbelt in the rain. She was a voice others leaned on. After the conference, she returned to her apartment, exhaustion mingling with fulfillment. On the kitchen counter lay an envelope addressed in her mother's handwriting. She opened it slowly, her heart steady rather than racing. The letter was filled with regret. Linda's words apologizing for the silence, for the pleas to protect reputation over her daughter. "I failed you when you needed me most," it read. "I do not expect forgiveness, only that you know I am sorry." Rebecca folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the envelope. She did not feel compelled to reply. Some wounds could not be mended with ink. Forgiveness was not an obligation. It was a choice, and she chose not to carry their guilt. She stepped onto the balcony as dusk painted the sky in streaks of orange and violet. The city hummed below, alive and indifferent. She breathed deeply, the cool air filling her lungs with the weight of possibility. Ethan was still in prison. Robert had retreated into obscurity after resigning. Linda faded from the social circles she once prized. Their consequences were real and public. But Rebecca's life was defined not by their downfall, but by her rise. She had moved from victim to survivor to advocate. She had found meaning in helping others navigate the darkness she had once endured alone. She returned inside, her gaze falling on the framed copy of the court's public release that allowed her to use the footage for educational purposes. It hung beside her law degree, symbols of survival and achievement standing side by side. Claire entered with 2 mugs of tea, handing one to Rebecca. "You did well today," she said with a smile. "You are changing lives." Rebecca nodded, her eyes soft. "I am not just surviving anymore. I am thriving." They clinked mugs gently, the sound small but resonant. Later, as Rebecca prepared for bed, she looked into the mirror and whispered the words she wished she had heard years ago. "You were never weak. You were never worthless. And now you are free." She turned off the light, letting the darkness settle without fear. The story that had once been buried beneath lies was now written in court records, in news articles, in the hearts of those she had spoken to. Her truth no longer needed defending. It stood on its own, solid and unshakable. As she drifted to sleep, she remembered the roar of the highway, the sting of rain, the moment she thought her life would end. She contrasted it with the calm of her apartment, the warmth of friendship, the certainty of purpose. She had walked through the storm and emerged not only alive, but stronger. If anyone listening to her story ever doubted their worth, she wanted them to remember her words. Evidence speaks louder than fear. And survival can lead to something greater: freedom, justice, and the power to speak for those still silenced.